It's wonderful to be gathered in these very strange days of COVID tide as we continue to navigate our way week to week with what are the latest numbers, how are we doing, what is feeling safe for me. And so again, in these strange days, it's tempted to be constricted and to live with a sense of lack rather than a sense of abundance. We notice the things that we miss. We notice in our Sunday church life, for example, that we are wearing masks, that we're not singing, that we don't get together for coffee, that sense of all cozily being like the 4,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 people who gathered around with Jesus. Wasn't it odd? Don't you think? It reflects a little of the society of Jesus' days that they count all the men, but the women and children don't get counted as a number. We could explore that another time, but it reveals some of the work that still needs to be done in understanding how we account for differences in gender and what that means. Age, life status. What kind of value do we accord people when we count one group and don't bother counting the other group? That is one of the scarcities. We narrow and constrict and limit our field. It's interesting to follow St. Paul through his journey with the Corinthian community as he tries to raise funds for relief of the saints in Jerusalem. Saints, God's devoted ones. Again, saints in the broadest sense of the word. Everyone who has experienced the divine compassion in any way or expressed the divine compassion in any way is one who is practitioner of compassion. And the word saint, following back to its Hebrew origins, means all of those things. The word for compassion, or chesed in Hebrew, means love, compassion, devotion, and faithfulness all rolled into one. And as such, that is both a representation of the divine being and way of being in the world, and also our experience of it. So as saints, we are simply ones who acknowledge that, experience it, and pass it on. And that's what Paul appeals to in terms of the sense of abundance. I can't imagine how difficult it would be to raise support in a world with no internet, no financial reliable, shall we say, institutions. The only thing you can do is gather coins in a bag, take them in a boat and travel for weeks on end and hope that you don't get shipwrecked and that you can do something with the coins at the end of the journey when they safely get there. What an amazing undertaking. And yet we live in a world where you can press a button and you can buy things without even noticing that you spent the money. Very dangerous, isn't it? And you can go into stores and just flash a card and suddenly there's all of your groceries for the week. And yet Paul is completely undeterred in his belief that the abundance of these small group of Christians in Corinth can also provide for the needs of others. And so it is, we provide our way around the world with our donations to the Primates World Relief and Development Fund, our donations to the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and of course, the way in which we support our local ministries right in front of our nose. Maybe it's a good time in the context of Paul's words about generosity, his words about avoiding any kind of compulsion or reluctance, to simply focus on what have we been blessed with and how can we share that with others. It's a time of the year, perhaps, where stewardship, our responsibility for the earth and our responsibility for our communities is at the forefront of many of our minds. We have all experienced difficulties economically, and so people's ability to share varies, and that's the beauty of the tradition of the tithe or the proportional giving, that you give from what you receive, not by a set taxed rate at exact percentages, but rather that you, out of what is God's abundance to you, pass it on to others. As I look at this gorgeous building in which we sit, as I look at the needs to care for the graves of our ancestors and what will perhaps for some of us be our own final resting place, we realize that none of these things, from office computers and phones to people to those whom we tend to buildings and roof and everything, none of these things fall from the sky without our own commitment to ensure that they are still here. So I bless and thank God this day for every one of the many hundreds of donors who allow us to continue our ministry in this place, to have warmth and comfort and seating, to gather for inspiration, to share in the divine compassion and to express that in our daily life. Surely we come here for inspiration, folks, do we not? We come here for the bread of life. And as I give thanks, I do not hesitate, like St. Paul, to encourage us towards even greater generosity, sharing and blessing of one another through our financial and other gifts as expressions of God's generosity to us. The harvest is even greater when we sow generously. Interestingly, Jesus, of course, deals with the bread and the fish in our gospel reading today. Perhaps fish and bread stand for those two archetypal forms of sustenance that have brought us to this day. If it were not for our ancestors who were hunters and fisher folk, we would not be here today. If it were not for our ancestors and those around us today who sow the seeds to raise the grain and harvest the crop, we would not have bread on our table. And for those of us who reach the time in our lives when perhaps sowing and reaping and harvesting may be a little beyond our physical capacities, we realize even more our dependence on those who provide for our needs in today's world. Once in a while, in addition to that endless daily round of feeding ourselves breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks, and beverages, and so forth, rather like the crowd in Jesus' day, sometimes, just now and again in our lives, something so overtakes us that we lose all track of time and space and even our most basic daily needs to feed ourselves. And sure enough, Jesus finds himself in a situation where a whole crowd of people, more than 4,000, I don't know how many women, children did follow along, multiple thousands of people go 3 days without eating because they are so feeding on the bread of life. They are so desperate to hear what Jesus has to say, to follow him, to be with him, to be in his presence. Surely Jesus must have been emitting this light of God's glory. Surely the teachings of Jesus must have been this very wave of compassion, the divine faithfulness and generosity absolutely waving over them like the billows of the sea, that they are so swept away with this magnificence and their own need to be fed by that they even forget about dinner. It is a tradition of the First Nations in this continent that fasting for 3 days without food and even without water is one of the ways in which we prepare to meet the Creator. I know I've spoken to one of our own Indigenous folks who have passed from this life, and she spoke to me of her earlier days of experiencing that 3-day fast without food and water. I remember my mother saying to me, "Don't do it, you can't go 3 days without water." I'm not encouraging you to do something that is not part of your familiar ways. I'm just acknowledging that there are times and there are traditions where when we cease doing our daily round, we open up our hearts to something that is bigger than us. And Jesus cares very much at both levels for the needs of the soul and the needs of the body. And so having taught and healed and encouraged and revealed the light of God for these 3 days, he recognizes that we are in the risk zone and we need to meet some practical needs right now. He says if they don't eat, they may collapse on the way home. This is actually a physical danger time. We need to do something. Of course, the disciples, like most of us, maybe me, would say, well, how on earth? We're in the middle of nowhere. What are we going to do to feed these many thousands of people? And so they produce what they have. It seems amazing to me as well that the church itself, and indeed all of these ministries across the world, which are so, in one sense, weak and dependent and unlikely, just the few of us gathered together could actually feed a multitude. That if we take the gifts, as Shirley Murray's hymn encourages us, and present them to God, the gift of who we are and the little that we have, in the miracle and mystery of the gospel, this little broken me, who doesn't seem to have so much, is able to be broken open for the life of the world. And so it is that these 7, that's always the number of completion in Scripture, the number of perfection, the number to which we come around, our Sabbath number, the day in which we rest and renew and begin again. So it is that Jesus is able to give rest, renewal, restoration, and a new beginning to these people through the word of life that is bread, and through the literal bread and fish that feed their bodies. They all ate, we learn, and were satisfied. It's so beautiful to reach the harvest time of our lives. Rabbi Schachter Shalomi, in his book From Aging to Saging, looks at human life as if it were 12 months of the year starting in January. And then for every 7 years, to use this 7 analogy of the perfect number, he says there's a different stage of being in your life. So I would be in the 62 to 69-year-old category now, which he describes as harvest time. It's the autumn of our lives as we start to reap the greatest benefits and share them with others. And then for those of you who might be 69 plus, well, we'll get another time to share what all of it is to be the fullest elder of your winter time, to be entering into your richest and most complete time, even when our bodies have some of the needs and limitations that obviously these people gathered with Jesus did as well. And so it is that there is an orientation towards completion, and that when we share abundantly from the gifts that we've received, even more of us is broken open. your little or your large that you can give of yourself can multiply way, way beyond anything you can imagine, and give life and hope and meaning and sustenance to thousands, perhaps millions of others in ways that you cannot even imagine. All you need to do is present what you have, to give freely and fully, and allow yourself to be broken open as Jesus did for the life of the world. Amen. Let's take a moment of quietness to reflect upon these words. We begin and end our silence with the sound of the bell.